How many of you in I think it was probably the 1970s, saw one of those two films, either A Thief in the Night or A Distant Thunder? Just wave. I know Steve did. Did anyone else see either of those films? Thief in the Night, Distant Thunder? Yeah, okay. Or read the Left Behind books? No? Oh, no. Okay. There were a couple of films put out about a particular understanding of today's reading and bits of revelation. And when I volunteered, when I said to Steve, you've got enough on at the moment, I'll preach this week, that was because I hadn't seen the reading. And then I don't think either Steve or I would have wanted to preach, because we were both traumatized as young people by watching these films, which were deliberately terrifying. And probably the closest I've come in my life to throwing in Christianity was after watching that film. Because if Christianity contains something as terrifying, as horror-filled as they were trying to tell me, I didn't want anything to do with it. So I think the first thing when we come to readings like this is not to let those sort of kind of dystopic ideas be the uppermost. We love God because he loves us, not because he terrifies us into obedience. So if we're not going to do that, what do we do with passages like this? And I think we start by admitting that we really don't understand Jesus. The disciples didn't understand Jesus. We still don't. Now, looking back, maybe Jesus was talking about the fall of the temple in 70 AD. Probably a bit of it is about that. Maybe he's talking about his second coming, but nothing is clear except for one thing. And that one thing is that we don't know. Even Jesus doesn't know when this will happen. And so Jesus, all around this passage, is urging his followers not to spend their whole time trying to decode signs, because there won't be any signs. This is going to be unexpected. We can't control it. So don't bother trying. And the thing is that there are so many things in our life, big things, that are unexpected and out of our control. This is one of them, but there are many. COVID-19 brought it home to most of us. And to be brutally realistic, none of us knows when our own death will come. We could take the reading that is about the second coming and say, well, two of us could be walking up a hill and one die before the other because a rock falls on them. Two of us could be asleep in bed and one die before morning. We know this happens. We have managed to control so much of our lives in the last couple of centuries, but there are always going to be things that overthrow that control. Life is just uncertain. Now, I know that all sounds terribly depressing. So why was Jesus trying to get this across to his disciples, and why am I doing it now? I think it's because Jesus wanted his disciples to be ready, to get them into the right place to deal with all the upheavals that were still ahead of them and are still ahead of us. So at the risk of simplifying something really complex, I think most of us tend to react to being reminded of the uncertainty of life in one of three ways. Some people face this uncertainty squarely and decide, well, actually, life is completely random and meaningless, but it's all we've got, so let's deal with it. And that's kind of stoicism, really. More common in our time is to pretend to ourselves that actually we can control and plan and everything is going to go smoothly, which is complacency. Or when everything we thought we had control of does fall around our ears, we despair. So stoicism, complacency, despair. And I think Jesus is trying to guide his followers away from all three of those towards something else, which is a wide awake hope. Complacency and despair kind of cause a fog around us. It's almost as if we're half asleep. It's difficult to act when we're feeling either in despair or complacent. And we need to wake up from both of those. Stoicism can have action, but tends to have it without much hope. And Jesus wants to instill our hope, our lives with hope. Think about a couple of these. Think about complacency. It's not the same as trust or faith. It's when we're happy to ignore the harsh realities of the world because we're okay. It's when we arrogantly feel certain that if we only plan a little bit better, or if only science develops a little bit further, we're going to be able to solve and control every aspect of our life. Now, to those of us who are in that trap, Jesus shakes us awake. He says, you're like the people in Noah's time, who were getting on with life thinking everything was fine. Catastrophe hit and they were completely unprepared. Wake up. Life is uncertain. Might be unsettling, but it's realistic. And unless we're awake to that, then when something like COVID-19 hits, we descend into anxiety and despair because our foundations, the foundations of our complacency, have been knocked aside. So that leads to the next issue. There's so many young people who are facing climate change and the impossibility of buying a house or reaching the goals society sets them. And they've left complacency behind, but they're heading fast for despair. Us as a church, we sometimes teeter on the brink of that as well, because we've lost the complacent assurance that people are just going to rock up on a Sunday without us having to do anything. What do? Do we face it stoically until we die? Do we despair? Or do we live in hopeful awakeness? Hopeful awakeness. Because there is another side to all of this. It's when we get rid of complacency, only then that we can be awake to wonder and gratitude, to a sense of adventure, which of course is based on the whole word Advent. Advent is meant to be a time of adventure, because today is utter gift. There is no reason we should be alive to see it and be part of it, but we are, and that's amazing. Living it is in itself an adventure. Or another thing, at the beginning of the service, I was looking at all the beautiful churches that were coming up and how different they were to each other. They are a beautiful gift. They may not last, the temple didn't, but right now they're a gift. And every person sitting around you right this minute is a gift, because none of them had to come. The fact that they have is grace and gift. And once we push aside complacency, we can wake up to every instant of God's grace. And it's when we instill hope into that story as well, that we can crawl out of paralysis that stoicism, despair, and complacency create. Jesus rocked the foundation that his disciples were standing on to show them that that foundation was made of sand, and to persuade them to build the foundation of their life on God instead. Not the sandy foundation of our own control and power, but the solid rock of God, who alone holds us firm through every single uncertainty that life throws at us. The God who's bigger than the fall of the temple or COVID or even climate change. The God who's a foundation that can't be shaken even by death. The God who one day will bring about a world where weapons are turned into ploughshares and lions lie down with lambs, but who in the meantime has given us this day as gift to live and work for him in hopeful wakefulness. There's that famous story about Martin Luther, who was asked what he would do if the world were to end tomorrow. And he said, "I'd plant an apple tree today." Now that's an answer from someone who is full of hopeful awakeness. Today's a gift. We're to be awake to that and live it because it might be our last, but not to worry either, because we're living in thankfulness and hope. Our foundation isn't on the passing, changing uncertainties of life, but on our eternal God. And I believe, God, this season welcomes us into that adventure of life.